Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. It's time for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll be reading Chapter 4 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Next stop, or should I say, Nest Stop, Chapter 4. Here we go. Bernie was kind of different. He came from the West Coast, San Diego, California to be precise, and had this cool dude air about him. With impossibly curly sandy blonde hair and bell-bottom jeans covered in patches, he looked as if he had just stepped off a surfboard. The first time I met him, I had just stepped off a Greyhound bus from Palatka in a button-down shirt, my straight hair slicked to one side, after playing some small gig at a woman's club in the swampy flats of eastern Florida. I wasn't yet 16 years old. "Are you Don?" he asked, strolling toward me. "Don Felder?" "Yeah," I replied, a little warily, holding my guitar case to my chest. I had been expecting my mother to pick me up from the bus station. "I'm Bernie Leadon," he said with a smile that lit up his whole face. "Your mom said I'd find you here. Do you need a ride?" He pointed over to his '63 Ford Falcon, brand new, in light baby blue, open mouthed. I nodded. "I'm new in town," he explained as we pulled away. Looking around, I noticed an acoustic flat-top Martin on the back seat. I went into the music store and asked them for the name of the best guitarist in Gainesville. Someone named Buster gave me yours. I went to your house, but your mom said you were on your way back from a gig. So, here I am, again, that grin. "Oh, okay," I said. "I'm hoping to put together a band and thought maybe you and I could jam together for a bit," he went on as I sat silently next to him. "What do you play?" "Fender Stratocaster," I replied proudly. "Anything else?" he asked. My face fell. "No, not really. Drums a little. How about you?" "Acoustic, banjo, mandolin, flat-top bluegrass, that sort of thing." Back at my parents' house, all thoughts of embarrassment temporarily forgotten, I led Bernie up to my room and watched as he pulled out his guitar. I didn't even own an acoustic guitar. I felt I sort of graduated past that. If I couldn't plug it in and turn it up, I didn't want it. You didn't see B.B. King playing acoustic, after all. But Bernie just blew me away that afternoon with his amazing flat-picking music. I was dazzled that someone so young could be so unbelievably well-versed. Almost shyly, I pulled out my Fender and played the best I could for him. I think I cobbled together a medley of Chet Atkins, Elvis, and Ventures hits. "Wow, man, that's great," he said, grinning from ear to ear in open appreciation. "Buster was right. You're good. Real good." Within a week, we'd walked into Lipham Music together and ordered 2 new guitars, an electric Gretsch for him and an acoustic for me, determined to teach each other everything we knew. Over the next few months, he taught me the finer nuances of country and western music, and I taught him rock and roll. Before long, we started putting some songs together, and I felt I found a completely new level to rise to. Meeting Bernie was one of the best things that has ever happened to me. Bernie's father was a nuclear physicist who had been relocated from San Diego. He was to put together one of the largest of all nuclear development research centers at the University of Florida. Bernie was the oldest of 10 children, one of whom was a young guitarist called Tom, who ended up playing with Tommy Petty's new band, Mudcrutch, which was right behind us on the fraternity circuit. Every time I went over to see Bernie, there seemed to be another new baby brother or one on the way. But it didn't seem to matter because their house was 4 times the size of mine, with air conditioning and every modern convenience. Bernie had already played in several different bluegrass bands in San Diego, including one called the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers, with a singer-slash-songwriter and mandolin player named Chris Hillman, who later helped form the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers. The Squirrel Barkers had even had an album released. As well as the talents I already knew about, Bernie was an amazing 5-string banjo player, the best I had ever heard. He'd have given Earl Scruggs a run for his money. He had been playing ever since he was a kid and was proficient since the age of 13. He knew all the best Smoky Mountain songs, and before I knew it, we wound up forming a bluegrass band together, in which I played acoustic guitar and he played banjo, while a friend who worked for the Florida Fish and Game Commission played mandolin. Inspired, we pieced together another band called the Mondi Quintet to play the sort of music I was into. We found a singer named Tom Logan and a drummer named Wayne Boomer Hugh. We came up with the name Mondi Quintet because it sounded so English at a time when there was a passion for all things British, especially the Beatles. Boomer's mother bought him an old van to travel to gigs in, on the side of which was painted "Place for quilting, bees, funerals, and wild parties." The same motto is on our business card. We thought we were so cool. As the Mondi Quintet increased in stature, so the bookings became more and more frequent. I could make us $200 for a Friday night or Saturday night fraternity party or a high school prom, which was probably more than my dad was making in a week. He'd have really been hurt if he had known, or put it down as a flash in the pan. At least I was keeping busy, and what else was I going to do? Get a job working at Coppers? That wasn't going to happen. Those frat parties were wild. It was just like Animal House, with everyone drunk out of their minds. Near-lethal cocktails of hard liquor were guzzled in alarming quantities, and even more outrageous dares dreamed up. My brother had been in a fraternity briefly, but had stepped out because it was too crazy for him. These boys knew how to party, and we were more than happy to provide the soundtrack to their madness. Personally, I never had much of a taste for alcohol. If I did drink, my poison of choice was pop-top beer. I went to a party once where everyone was drinking gin, and I tried it, but it tasted like aftershave lotion. I excused myself and went outside to retch violently. My first attempt at smoking pot was similar. I didn't know anything about marijuana, but someone took me to see a guy who grew his own. In those days, you could buy a quarter of an ounce for $5, hence the term nickel bag. "What is that?" I asked, looking at the mound of green grass on his kitchen table. "Try some," my friend said, smiling, and handed me my first joint. I'd never laughed so long or so hard in my life. When the laughter finally subsided, leaving my ribs aching, I was suddenly incredibly hungry. The dealer fetched a jar of peanut butter, and we took a spoonful each, but when it stuck to the roofs of our mouths, we laughed even harder, spitting globules of it all over the kitchen. After that, we listened to some music, and everything sounded really great. I thought, oh my God, these guys are geniuses, absolutely brilliant. And it was someone perfectly ordinary, like the Kingston Trio. Once the fun was over and I was by myself, though, I became paranoid. There was a great deal of propaganda in those days about drug abuse, especially in a university town full of kids. The ads said that marijuana automatically led to heroin, and then you'd grow hair on the palms of your hands, go blind, and die. My father would have killed me if he had known what I was up to, and if he hadn't, my brother, the law student, would have gladly prosecuted me. I didn't get overly involved in drugs for fear of their wrath and of turning my brain to mush. That summer, we managed to book some gigs in Daytona Beach and Fort Lauderdale, which seemed real grown up. There were dozens of openings for musicians in Daytona during the high season, and we were prepared to do anything for cash, in or out of the Mondi Quintet. I played solo with house bands for people like Tommy Rowe and the Romans, or in a band on the pier for a visiting black singer called Rufus Thomas, who dubbed himself the world's oldest teenager, and had a big hit at the time called Walking the Dog. 1964 was the height of the Beatles' success, with I Wanna Hold Your Hand at the top of the charts. The Fab Four arrived to a hysterical reception in New York, and after appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show, took America by storm. The look and sound of the Mondi Quintet remained very English. We mainly performed covers of pop songs like Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, the old-school instrumental Green Onions, or the latest from John, Paul, George, and Ringo. During each set, we'd play at least one of our original numbers, which the audience had to suffer through. We made many new friends, mostly other musicians also working the strip, in bands like the Nightcrawlers or the House Rockers. Among our new buddies were two brothers named Dwayne and Greg Allman, who were about the same age as us, and who had moved to Daytona with their mother from Nashville. Dwayne was an unbelievably gifted lead guitarist, and Greg had a soulful, great voice and played keyboards. They had a killer band, including a bass player and a drummer named Menard, who was missing two front teeth. They wore their hair really long, all the way down their backs, and Dwayne had big sideburns, which was a very modern look for that time. They were true hippies, heavily into pot, as was Bernie, although I still didn't care for it much. Their band was initially called the Spotlights and later the Almond Joys, after the candy. Bernie and I would play a gig at a teenage bar called The Wedge, where they didn't serve booze, and when we'd finish, we'd go over to the bar on the pier or to the Martinique on Main Street, where the Allman Brothers were playing until 2 a.m. to sink a few beers. On afternoons off, we'd hang out at their mother's house and smoke pot, because our only alternative was to stay in our flea-bag hotel on our own. She never seemed to mind her house being filled with her son's friends, and would often cook us all breakfast. Dwayne was the first guy I ever saw play slide guitar. I remember watching him placing the smoothed-off neck of a bottle of Budweiser on his finger and sliding it up and down the frets in his mom's living room and being as amazed by what he could do as I had been with Bernie's flat top and banjo. It was yet another level opening up to me. Until then, Bernie had been the most talented musician I knew. Now, Dwayne was surpassing even his high standards. He inspired me to play slide, and that summer showed me my first couple of tunings. "Close your eyes and listen to the music, man," Dwayne told me as I slid my own long-necked bud top along the strings. "Feel it in your heart, and when your spine tingles, you'll know it's right." I felt like I was getting the best tutorial anyone could have, because he was quite simply a phenomenon. With my musical maturity came a newfound desire for better and better instruments. I knew that I had outgrown my Fender by then, and I really wanted a Gibson. When a second-hand Les Paul Custom came into Lipham's, I knew I had to have it. The finish was cracked and the gold was fading, but it was a beautiful guitar. Even Mr. Lipham could see that. "I'm going to send this back to Gibson and have them refinish it," he told me, "and when it comes back, I'll sell it to you for a good price." "Well, when that guitar comes back, I want to buy it," I told him. "I'll trade in my Stratocaster, so just put it on my account and I'll pay it off." It was going to cost in the region of $250, which was a huge upgrade. That summer I worked over at Daytona Beach real hard to earn the money, and when I returned, I asked Mr. Lipham if the Les Paul had come back yet. "Yes, son," he said sadly, "it did, and it looked mighty fine. I took it out of its case and put it on the wall, and some guy from New York walked right in and offered me a wad of cash. I'm sorry, Don." I was really upset, especially as I had waited so long. Mr. Lipham took the charge off my account, but then I ordered a new red Gibson 355 that looked just like the guitar that Chuck Berry played. Chuck was totally cool. He'd had a string of hits in 1964 with songs like Nadine, You Never Can Tell, and No Particular Place to Go, and he had already made music industry history by being the first black man singing to a white audience and achieving mainstream success with songs like Maybelline and Johnny B. Good. Every red-blooded guitar player in the country wanted to be like Chuck. That thin-lined, hollow-bodied Gibson took over a year to be built in the factory. I loved it from the moment it arrived. It was the best $300 I ever spent. You know you've got yourself a good guitar when you pick it up, tune it, and after you played it for a while, it's still in tune. No matter how good the sound and the action are, if the intonation isn't good, the guitar isn't good. I'd only had it a couple of months when the Mondi Quintet was invited to Miami for an audition at a huge new club called The World, which had 2 stages. With our matching red guitars, we drove all the way down there from Gainesville in our van. The gig went really well, and we thought that The World was the best club we had ever played in. However, when we arrived home and unloaded our stuff, my guitar was missing. Someone must have stolen it from the back of the van while we were loading up. I hadn't even paid for it yet, and I didn't have any insurance. I was heartbroken. Worse than that, I was guitarless. Needless to say, I had to go back to Lipham's and buy another guitar, a Les Paul off the wall, so I wasn't only paying for the one that was stolen, but the new one as well. My life took an upturn when my parents finally bought me a car. Up until then, my friends were all driving around in hot rods, while I still had my bicycle. Dad presented me with a baby blue Simca Hironde P60 as the perfect vehicle for me. It was an old French car, a make I'd never even heard of before. He must have done a deal with someone at work and bought it cheap. It was tremendously ugly and turned heads for all the wrong reasons, but it had 4 wheels and a running engine, and I was in no position to complain. Better even than the car, I had a new girlfriend, Sue McVie, my first true love. She was 16, a freshman in high school, and I was her first real boyfriend. My relationship with Sue came to an abrupt end after a road accident we had on our way to Georgia to get married. Her parents discovered that we were planning to elope and banned her from seeing me again. Either way, I always thought it was divine intervention. I wasn't ready to be married yet at 17. Someone was telling me they had other plans for me, and in hindsight, I guess they were right. Teenage entertainment in Florida revolved around music, girls, and the spectacular scenery all around us, which we'd pretty much taken for granted during our blinkered youth. In the summer of the mid-60s, however, there was more fun to be had than ever before, taking advantage of all three. Bernie and I were making reasonable money with our bands, almost enough for me to replace the Simca with a 62 Volkswagen Beetle. Dad helped me pay for it, something he felt he ought to do. He was still after me to concentrate on my schoolwork and get a real job, but I felt I was doing all right. I was working, and I had a car and a couple of girlfriends. Life was sweet. I spent most of my time hanging out with Bernie, Barry Scoran, Tom Langan, or the Rucker brothers, and I often stayed over with them when Dad and I had one of our frequent fights. Gainesville had its limitations, though, so whenever we could spare the time, we'd drive out to the lake for a change of scene, where several of our wealthier friends' families owned second homes. Tom's father had a boat and a house there, and the father of a boy in my class at school owned the local Mercury dealership. Their family house was on the edge of Blue Run, one of the underground springs that feeds the river systems in that part of the state. Beautiful fresh water bubbles up and runs off into crystal clear rivers 30 feet deep. They were far too tempting for teenage boys to ignore. We'd spend whole days swimming or just lying on the dock in the sun. Tom taught me how to water ski with the added incentive that the lake waters were infested with snakes, alligators, and snapping turtles. If I lost my footing, I had to tread water as calmly as possible and hope the boat would turn around soon to pick me up. The best fun of all, though, was hydroplaning. We'd cram into a low small boat with a 7.5 horsepower engine on it and a ski rope attached to the back. Onto that we'd hook up a little wooden board about 2.5 feet long and 12 inches wide. One of us would get into the water and float along behind the boat, wearing a face mask while holding on to the board. As the boat gathered speed and towed you along with the board, you could put pressure on it to take you down under the water. If you tilted it to one side, you'd literally soar through the water like a bird. When you couldn't hold your breath anymore, you'd aim the board upward and emerge spluttering and gasping for air before going back down again. The water was full of wildlife, and you could see as clear as day. There were even manatees down in that part of the Blue Run, gentle seal-like creatures that sailors often mistook for mermaids. The risk with hydroplaning was that at any time you could have been slammed up against a hidden tree root or some sort of other underwater obstacle. But we were young and idiotic, and we didn't care. At night, we'd go frog gigging in the swamps. With one of us carrying a flashlight, we'd row out on a pole boat to where the frogs were floating on top of the water, croaking their affection to each other for all they were worth. When we shone the high-powered light across the surface of the swamp, all we could see were yellow and red eyes, yellow for frogs, red for alligators. Creeping up on the floating, half-blinded frogs, one of us would yell, "Gig!" And we'd gig, spear the creatures with a long pole at the end of which was a 3-pronged barb, lifting it, still wriggling into a basket. Once our basket was full, we'd head back to the shore, pick off the legs and dip them in batter, before frying them up on a campfire. They tasted kind of like fried chicken and were mighty good washed down with a couple of cold beers. Bernie was dating a girl named Judy Lee, whose family owned a house out at Macanopy, which was on one of our favorite lakes. Bernie and Judy were getting quite serious at a time when I was between girlfriends and more than a little jealous. One night after a teen dance gig we played at a local Holiday Inn. Bernie arranged to meet Judy outside the Howard Johnson Motel in Gainesville, and she brought her best friend along. "Hi," she said, waving at me shyly. "I'm Susan Pickersgill. I've heard a lot about you." She smelled of almonds. "Hi," was all I could manage in reply. I took one look at this sweet little baby-faced angel with straight blonde hair, and I was smitten. Fortunately, she looked at me with my grease-back hair and cigarette tucked into the sleeve of my t-shirt and felt the same way. Susan came from the right side of the tracks. She was from a long line of Pickersgills, far superior to the Teutonic Felders, who rode down the track on mules. She was a direct descendant of Mary Pickersgill, who made the original Star-Spangled Banner for Fort McHenry in 1813, which now hangs in the Smithsonian. Best of all, her mother liked me. I was clean-cut, and my parents had taught me manners. I was courteous and showed a lot of respect with my yes ma'ams and thank you sirs. They were pleased that Susan had found someone like that. If they only knew how few courtesies I showed their daughter in their absence. Mr. Pickersgill was a well-regarded civil engineer from the Northeast, on a short-term contract to build a veterans hospital in Gainesville. The project was 6 months from completion, after which Susan would be returning home to Boston with him and the rest of her family. The clock was ticking against us, but we fell madly, crazily in love. Susan was a student at P.K. Young, a private high school for the children of the professors and other professionals involved with the university. She and Judy were in the same class. Before long, we became a regular foursome, two couples who went to gigs and hung out together. Bernie and I would drop the girls off and then go smoke pot together in the back of his car in the high school parking lot. I was always terrified one of my teachers would come out and catch us inside his smoke-billowing Ford Falcon. Worse, I feared my father might drive by. Dad and I were not getting along at all well. We argued at almost every encounter, usually about where my life was heading. How long are you going to go on bumming around, playing guitar, and getting high with your friends? He'd ask. Long as I, well, choose, I'd reply, slamming the screen door shut behind me in anger. Music had once been the glue that bonded us together, and now it was tearing us apart. Whenever the atmosphere became too intense, I'd slip away for a couple days and stay with friends, especially Jim, the DJ at the local radio station who still lived above the funeral home. I'd come home after a couple of days and spend my time avoiding Dad. It wasn't any better when Jerry left. He and Marnie married when he turned 21 and graduated from law school. I helped him pack up his few belongings in the room we had shared for so many years, and then drove them over to the second-story apartment they had rented in an old house in the next neighborhood. "Thanks, Don," Jerry said, patting me on the back as I finished unloading the last of his stuff. "Maybe you could try to get along a bit better with Dad now that I'm gone, okay?" I shook his hand and nodded silently, still in awe of him, even more so now that he was married and leaving home. I drove straight back to our house, rearranged the bedroom to my liking, and moved in Dad's voice and music machine. Standing on a chair, I removed the 100-watt light bulb from the overhead lamp. Reaching into my pocket, I replaced it with the low-wattage red one I had bought specially. This was my room now, and I could play my guitar when I liked, as loud as I liked, in a scarlet spotlight just like Jimi Hendrix. With my brother sorely missed at home as both a steadying influence and a companion, Dad became increasingly frustrated with me. Jerry was respectable. He had been the model son, and his morals and lifestyle only highlighted my shortcomings even more sharply. By contrast, I'd taken part in several anti-Vietnam War demonstrations and political rallies, and let my hair grow even longer to fit in with the rest of the guys, and my father quite rightly suspected me of being involved with drugs. My final bust-up with Dad was a long time coming. It had been such an adversarial relationship for so long, something had to give. One day I was supposed to come home and do some mundane task like wash the dishes or mow the lawn or take the laundry out and hang it on the line. For some stupid reason, probably because I was too busy playing guitar or smoking dope, I didn't do it. When I eventually came home, my mother gave me flack about it, and peeved, I gave her a bunch of sass right back. "I don't have to do your dishes," I told her. "I'm not your slave." She stopped and looked at me for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "You just wait till your father comes home," she said through thin lips. I went up to my room to sulk, and heard Dad arrive home a few hours later. Within minutes, he was at my bedroom door. "You'll never speak to your mother like that again, you lazy, no-good, long-haired hippie," he yelled as he pulled off his belt. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" I remember sitting on the bed, trying to protect myself with my hands, while he started beating me on the back with the strap of his belt. I had put up with that belt my whole life, but for some reason, I suddenly decided I wasn't going to take it anymore. Jumping up, I clenched my fist and struck Dad as hard as I could across the chin. He staggered back with the force of the blow, hands and belt flailing, and crashed to the floor, landing awkwardly against a bookshelf and a pile of long-playing records. I'll never forget the look on his face. I think he was more stunned than anything. I literally ran out of the bedroom, jumped into my car, and took off before he could grab me. I could hear him all the way through the house as I fled, but I didn't know if he was yelling at me or screaming at Mom to help him get to his feet. I left home vowing never to speak to him again. It was 6 years before I did. I moved in with Barry Scoran, the bass player with the Mondi Quintet, who was a sophomore at the university, with an apartment in an off-campus housing area. He put me on his couch for a few days, but eventually gave me a spare bedroom, for which I began paying rent. I went back to my parents' house a couple of times while they were at work to retrieve some clothes and some LPs I simply couldn't live without. I didn't leave a note, and they had no idea where I was staying. I finally picked up the phone and called Mom to let her know I was all right. "Please come home, Don," she pleaded. We're worried about you." "No, Mom," I replied flatly. I'm just not going to come back and do that anymore. My father made no direct contact, but told me through my mother that if I wasn't going to live in his house, I was to bring back the car he'd held me by. Furious, I drove the Volkswagen home and parked it outside, leaving the keys in the ignition. He knew how much being without a car would cramp my lifestyle. Even more gallingly, he took to driving it himself. I'd see it all around town and curse him under my breath. At least I still had Susan, and the Mondi Quintet was doing well. Bernie, Tom, and I continued to write songs together, although our repertoire mainly featured covers of popular numbers to keep the kids happy. There was never any conflict between us. We got along fine and were guided by what Tom was able to sing. Bernie and Tom were pretty much the driving force musically, and they wrote the bulk of the original numbers, although I have to admit, now they weren't very good. We thought they were at the time, but they weren't classics. Still, you have to start somewhere. What I'd always most admired about Bernie was his single-minded determination. If he decided that he was going to learn pedal steel guitar, he'd go and buy one, sit down, and learn it so that within a month or so he could play it to his satisfaction. He taught me such flexibility and adaptability to rise to the musical challenge of taking on a completely new instrument and genre. I never mastered pedal steel or mandolin like he did, but I was okay, and without him, I'd never have even tried. Bernie was seriously into the Beatles and English music. George Harrison was his hero. He even wore a Beatles wig at one time and adopted kind of an English accent. He dressed English and tried straightening his impossibly curly hair. Then he bought a brown Gretsch Tennessean guitar, the same model Harrison played. Man, he loved that instrument. I admired the Beatles enormously and appreciated how gifted they were, but for me, rhythm and blues had so much more soul. There was a big difference between women crying over B.B. King and girls screaming hysterically at the Beatles at Shea Stadium. I was also smart enough to realize that what the Beatles lacked in emotional drive, they made up for in cool. When the Hollies came to Gainesville and played a gig at the university, I jumped at the chance to go see them. Distinctive and well-respected, the group from Manchester, England had enjoyed a string of chart hits with songs like Searchin', Just One Look, and I'm Alive. I pushed my way to the front of the crowd and watched Alan Clark and Graham Nash singing their latest hit, Bus Stop, and I was mightily impressed. They looked so different. I took mental notes on their clothes and how they wore their hair. And there was something about Graham Nash's voice that really appealed to me. He not only played well, he looked like he was having fun. When he smiled down at me in the front row while singing, I couldn't help but smile back. While Bernie struggled to straighten his hair, I favored the classic page boy cut, long but curled under at the sides. Still white blonde, I looked more like Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones. As a band, we fully embraced the flower power era, with its big blousy sleeves and flared pants. We had some publicity photographs taken of the Mondi Quintet in which we look risible now. Especially Boomer Hugh, the drummer, with his perfect hair and English gent double-breasted jacket, his arms folded across his chest. Lord knows what people made of us. We cut 2 singles and became a regular circuit tour of Daytona, Tallahassee, Atlanta, New York, Miami, and Lauderdale, often with Susan and Judy in tow, acting as our personal groupies. Susan ferried me everywhere in her MGTD, which her father had bought her. It was a stick shift, and once she got it into 4th gear, she'd put her left foot up on the walnut dash and cruise us around Florida, tired of using the clutch. That spring, her parents returned to Boston, leaving Susan and her brother Bill behind. Bill was staying on in Gainesville for a few years as a student, and his presence gave Susan and me a few months' respite until the end of the summer. The family had sold their house, so Susan moved out to Judy Lee's house at McCanopy, about 10 miles south of Gainesville. To get there, I had to cross part of Payne's Prairie, a vast area of marsh, wet prairie, and open water, which is now a state reserve and national park. Back in the 60s, it was just another unmarked bog. There was a road called Savannah Boulevard, running right through the middle of the bog, with deep culverts on either side. The smart reptiles, the frogs, lizards, snakes, and alligators, climbed up onto the asphalt each night to soak up the warmth from the heat of the day. Every time I visited Susan on Barry's motorcycle, with my feet up on the handlebars in case I ran over a snake and it hit the wheel and rode up my leg, it felt like a medieval test. Make it through this, young knight, and you can win the fair damsel. That summer, we opened for a band called The Kirkle, who had a #2 hit by Paul Simon called Red Rubber Ball. They even gained a coveted spot on the Beatles' final U.S. tour. Their manager liked us and took us to New York to play a few club gigs, but a couple of the guys grew homesick and nothing more came of it, so Bernie and I went back to Daytona Beach gigging around. Susan and Judy joined us when they could. One night I had a big fight with Susan over something stupid and she stormed off. I think she wanted me to pay more attention to her and I was far too busy having fun and getting high. When we finished our gig, Bernie and I went over and watched the Almond Joys as usual, and afterward we smoked some pot. "Hey, I'm starving, man," I told Dwayne and Greg with a sudden pang of the munchies. "Let's go get something to eat." We found a diner that was open at 4 a.m., and the four of us sat in a booth by the window, drinking coffee, eating donuts, smoking cigarettes, and feeling pretty mellow, with the sun coming up on the horizon. Unbeknownst to me, Susan had been hunting for me all over Daytona Beach with Judy, hoping to patch things up. The two of them finally walked into this diner and saw us sitting there. All they could see of Dwayne and Greg was the back of their heads, each with beautiful long silky hair. Assuming the worst, Susan ran out, crying. Judy, furious, marched up to confront us. "Hey!" she yelled at Bernie. "What the do you think you're doing with these two girls?" Greg and Dwayne looked up at her in surprise. As soon as she saw their beards and mustaches, she realized her mistake. Man, we laughed till we cried. Just when things seemed to be going so well with the band, my personal life and my musical ambitions, Bernie dropped a bombshell. He had been dissatisfied for a while, wishing for greater success, and still wasn't getting along with his family. Like my parents, they were often nagging him about what he was planning to do with his life, and wanted him to pursue an academic career. Bernie was upset that they weren't being more supportive. "There's nothing here musically, man," he'd complain. "New York or California is where it's at, and I'm never gonna live in New York. I hate it. One of these days I'm gonna blow and just go back to California and make some real music." He'd been saying it for so long I had almost come to ignore it. Then one day he announced that he was leaving. "Come with me, Don," he urged, his eyes bright. "California has great weather, great women, and everything's really happening there. It's where my roots are. We could start up a band together and get something good going." I shook my head. "Gainesville might have little to offer, but it's all I've ever known," I told him. Truth was, I was scared to leave. I had hated New York, too. By contrast, California seemed far away, alien, and frightening. Like moving to the other side of the world. All the magazine articles and television programs I had seen implied it was a sin state, where people turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. Drug abuse was rife, and not just pot. LSD and other hallucinogens were all the rage, and anything went sexually. I was still a naive young teenager with a rather old-fashioned set of moral values, despite what my father thought. I knew the West Coast wasn't for me, not yet anyway. Coming from poverty had also made me inherently cautious. I needed certainty, a surefire scheme to make money and pay the rent. It felt so scary to head off somewhere unknown with no offers of work and no solid opportunities identified. Bernie didn't really know anyone in Los Angeles and had few music contacts there anymore. In my worst nightmares, I'd imagined him falling in with drug dealers and pimps and never playing banjo again. However, he was determined to make a go of it, and there was nothing I could say to make him change his mind. The day he left, I went over to his parents' house and helped him load up his car. "I wish you were coming with me, buddy," he said, giving me a hug. "I know," I said, feeling unnervingly close to tears. He flashed me that huge grin of his and patted me warmly on the back. "I'll call you just as soon as I'm settled. If things work out, then maybe you could come out and join me?" "Sure," I lied, "as soon as you're settled." He climbed into the driver's seat of his Ford Falcon and turned the key in the ignition. The engine fired up into life with a big blue cloud of smoke from the exhaust. The car was loaded to the roof with instruments and clothes and equipment. Only the front passenger seat was empty. Bernie was leaving. He was driving to California to follow his musical dream. As I waved him off and watched his car disappear down the dusty trail west, it took all my nerve not to chase after him and jump into that empty seat. Well, that's the end of Chapter 4. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 4 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.